receive more favorable treatment in U.S. courts? American companies or Chinese companies? Surprisingly, current U.S. law favors Chinese government-owned companies over American companies in all U.S. courts. In August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina, the costliest natural disaster in American history, struck the Gulf Coast of the United States. Yet little did anyone know that for thousands of those victims, their suffering had just begun. Over the next few years, 4,000 Americans affected by Katrina built new homes using drywall made by a subsidiary of the China National Building Materials Group. This drywall released sulfur emissions, which forced families to move out of their homes and caused extensive health issues, including difficulty breathing, respiratory infections, and severe headaches, among other problems amounting to anywhere from $15 to $25 billion in damage. Now, one might assume that this Chinese company, responsible for harming the health of hundreds of Americans and for billions of dollars in damage, was held accountable. One might think that the harmed American families would at least have the opportunity to make their case in a court of law. However, because the China National Building Materials Group is a state-owned enterprise, meaning it is owned by the government of China, it and its subsidiaries have immunity in all U.S. courts and are therefore shielded from any liability. This story of injustice is not the first or only of its kind. It is merely the tip of the iceberg of a massive body of evidence demonstrating that Chinese state-owned enterprises are being held above the law. It is because my partner and I believe that Chinese companies doing business in the United States should be held accountable under the laws of the United States that we stand resolved. The United States federal government should substantially reform its policies towards the People's Republic of China. So how did this happen? How could our nation, which values justice, accountability, and the rule of law, allow for Chinese companies to be held above the law? The answer to this question is the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act of 1976, also known as the FSIA, codified in Title 28 of the U.S. Code. This act was intended to protect a foreign government acting in its role as a government from suit in the United States, not a government-owned company. One way to think of it is that the FSIA was intended to protect nations, not nation-owned corporations. However, because of its poor wording and ambiguous terminology, Chinese state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, have construed the FSIA to shield them from all liability and U.S. courts. As international law reporter Chris Clayton put it in May of 2016, federal court rulings as far back as 1995 show that Chinese corporations successfully got cases against them dropped under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, a law meant to give sovereign nations immunity from being sued. The law was aimed at protecting government agencies acting on behalf of that nation. Yet, as Clayton goes on to note, Chinese companies have argued that they are part of the Chinese government, and thus also immune from lawsuits. They have used the FSIA to escape legal action on suits ranging from shipping damages to bad drywall, to breach of contract, and defective fireworks. It is important to understand that the idea of sovereign immunity for Chinese state-owned enterprises in court is not an international requirement. When the United States courts misinterpreted the law back in 1995, they created an unprecedented ruling. In fact, besides the United States, no other country in the world gives sovereign immunity to state-owned enterprises. And according to the Foundation for Economic Education, the doctrine appears nowhere in the U.S. Constitution, and some scholars argue that it is wholly inconsistent with the basic nature of America's government. U.S. Senator Chuck Grassley put it perfectly when he noted in September of 2016 that while foreign investment in the United States is generally a good thing, we must ensure that entities, whether owned by a more traditional foreign-based company or a foreign government, all play by the same rules when it comes to U.S. law. And when state-owned enterprises are essentially using a get-out-of-jail-free card to escape legal action and transparency and accountability through the courts, leaving U.S. companies and consumers holding the bag, changes need to be made. Therefore, my partner and I propose the following plan. Our mandate is simple. Extend U.S. court jurisdiction to include all Chinese state-owned enterprises. Extend U.S. court jurisdiction to include all Chinese state-owned enterprises. Title 28, Section 1603D of the United States Code shall be amended to allow all state-owned enterprises of the People's Republic of China to be sued in U.S. courts. Our agents of change are Congress, the President, and any other needed agency or enforcement. No funding will be needed as this plan is purely legislative. Our plan will be passed immediately upon an affirmative ballot, and the affirmative team reserves the right to expand upon and clarify this plan as needed. Now, Senator Chuck Grassley outlined the two main purposes our plan serves when he stated in September of 2016 that first, it levels the playing field between foreign state-owned and foreign private companies by making both subject to suit in the United States on the same footing. Second, it brings clarity to the sometimes opaque structure of foreign state-owned enterprises and provides American companies and consumers the chance to prove their case against these companies just as against private companies. Let's examine both of these justifications more closely. Justification 1, equal playing field for state-owned and private companies. Equal playing field for state-owned and private companies. Matthew Eglin of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission summed up the issue perfectly when he wrote that despite the fact that the activities in which these entities engage are essentially commercial in nature, the FSIA permits them to masquerade in the marketplace and compete with their non-state counterparts while retaining the benefit of presumed immunity. The benefits of such a presumption of immunity are extensive and create an unjust imbalance between the plaintiff and the sovereign defendant, arguably constituting the most significant problem with the current structure of the FSIA. This is precisely what our plan faces. Under an affirmative ballot, Chinese state-owned enterprises would no longer have the unjust benefit of presumed immunity over non-governmental companies. This leads us to justification 2. Removing immunity gives American companies and consumers a chance to prove their case. Removing immunity gives American companies and consumers a chance to prove their case. Our nation has always stood for the principle that those that break the law should be held accountable under the law. Yet our current practice of allowing Chinese state-owned enterprises to plead the sovereign immunity defense destroys that honored principle. Furthermore, it puts non-governmental companies on an unlevel playing field. While private companies have to be accountable under the law, their state-owned counterparts are being held above the law. But most of all, our current policy is the antithesis of the American way, depriving thousands of Americans of justice. Hurricane Katrina was an unstoppable tragedy, but it led to a Chinese corporation taking advantage of U.S. citizens, and that could have been prevented. By siding with the affirmative team, you will be able to once and for all uphold the original intent of the FSIA and provide an avenue for thousands of victims to receive the justice that they have been denied for far too long. Our nation should never have allowed for Chinese companies to be held above the law, but with your help, it won't.